It's 7:04, maybe we can begin our program when other people come in. So hello and good evening. This is our sixth talk in a series, Elephant in the Room, exploring the future of museums. Next month on April 13, we'll have our concluding talk. It will be by Rick Cassini-Cadur and the Warhol Foundation for the Visual Art Curatorial Fellow. He's a fabulous speaker and will offer his ideas his knowledge, share his knowledge about whether museums can become 21st century public squares. The Elephant in the Room program was conceived and organized by Stuart Swift Research Center of the Henry Sheldon Museum in Middlebury, Vermont. My name is Eva Garcelon-Hart, and I'm the archivist and curator of the Sheldon Archives. I would like to acknowledge that we are broadcasting this program from Dakina, which is the ancestral homeland of the Abenaki peoples, now known as Vermont. And today I also would like to offer our express our solidarity with the people of Ukraine during these horrible times happening. It was almost, I think, 20 years when Professor Rachel Hope Cleves stepped into Henry Sheldon Museum archives and discovered one of our fabulous collections. And sometime later, in 2014, she published her book, which I have here, and some of you may be familiar with, Charity and Sylvia, Same-Sex Marriage in Early America. The book was a great success, and it also made our double silhouette, also from our collections, kind of instant celebrity, minor celebrity, but celebrity. It was published all over the country and beyond, in England, Holland, New Zealand, and other places. So we deeply appreciate that, that recognition and research that Rachel Cleves performed for so many years diligently in our collections. In 2014, we also, in collaboration with Middlebury College faculty, invited Rachel Hope to come to Middlebury to give a presentation to students at the college, and also to join us at the opening reception of the first and only time when documents from the collections were on public view. And I fondly remember this time and meeting her. It's almost 10 years ago. Also, I would like to say that her book is a great testimony to what can happen when a scholar and researcher comes into archives and really looks at materials which usually exist only in dark vaults of our storages. So it is so wonderful when that happens, and I would encourage all of you to really not to forget that there is still enormous wealth of information in our and many other archives across the country. And it is a myth that everything is on the internet. Only a fraction of collections was really digitized, so there is plenty of room to discovery. I would like to thank Vermont Humanities for a generous grant, which allowed us to have this series of talks between October last year and until April of next month. And also thank you to Dinse for additional support and to several private donors. We very much appreciate your help. This Talks are free and open to all, but if you feel so inclined, please support us, because your support allows us to continue programming like that. And we are conceiving at this point another series, this time tentatively called Elephant in the Archives, for the fall of 2022. One more remark, we will have also some opportunity to post questions. We prefer that you type questions in Q&A box rather than in chat. My colleague Taylor Rossini will moderate the discussion afterwards, so feel free to pose any questions you may have to Rachel Hope. And also all the talks which are in the series are recorded, so they can be accessed through our website. So you can always watch again this talk and many and the talks between October and now. And now, finally, I would like to introduce Professor Rachel Hope Cleves. She's a professor of history at the University of Victoria, British Columbia. She's best known for the book, Charity and Sylvia, Same-Sex Marriage in Early America, which I just showed you. And she has also researched and written about teenage female poet of the American Revolution, a gender-bending woman educator from 19th century Illinois, notorious British writer of the early 20th century, and further research that sheds new light on the history of sex and gender. Thank you so much to everybody who is here, and to Rachel Hope for being our guest speaker, and enjoy the evening.
Hello. Let me just launch my slideshow. All right, I assume you're all seeing the slideshow now. So I'd like to begin with a land acknowledgement. I'm speaking to you today from the traditional homelands of the Lekwungen peoples, the Sanghees and Esquimalt nations, and in a place we now call Victoria and Oak Bay. The word Lekwungen means a place to smoke herring, and as a settler descended from a displaced people who also loved smoked herring, I want to express my strong sense of connection to this beautiful place and my gratitude for being able to live and to work on these lands. So I'm speaking today about sex and gender in the archives, and I owe much of my career studying sex and gender in the archives to a visit I paid to the Henry Sheldon Museum in the summer of 2004. I couldn't find a picture from that 2004 visit, but I'm showing you a picture of my son dressing up at the museum in 2006, and then another picture from that return visit in the fall of 2014 that Eva spoke about in her opening remarks. So in the summer of 2004, I was on a family camping vacation to Lake Dunmore, and we took a day trip to Middlebury. On our stroll through the town, we stopped in at the Henry Sheldon Museum. I was then in the 7th year of my history PhD program at the University of California, Berkeley, and I was working on a dissertation about early US political history. As we entered the museum, my eyes caught sight of a sign that said archives. You know, I commented to my partner, there are all sorts of treasures in local history museums like this one. Who knows what's in these archives? So 6 months later, I was back at my desk in California reading a biography of the poet William Cullen Bryant to research the final chapter of my dissertation, which traced the abolitionist children of Federalist politicians and ministers. It was a 19th century biography, and so it included lots and lots of letters written by Bryant. And among those letters, included as a curiosity, was one that William Cullen Bryant had written about visiting his aunt, Charity Bryant, and her companion, Sylvia Drake, in Weybridge, Vermont during the summer of 1843. The letter was originally published in Bryant's newspaper, the New York Evening Post, and then it was reprinted in other national newspapers, actually all across the US, as well as in a collected book of Bryant's letters published afterwards. So William Cullen Bryant wrote in this letter, "If I were permitted to draw aside the veil of private life, I would briefly give you the singular and to me most interesting history of two maiden ladies who dwell in this valley. I would tell you how in their youthful days they took each other as companions for life, and how this union, no less sacred to them than the tie of marriage, has subsisted uninterrupted in uninterrupted harmony for 40 years, during which they have shared each other's occupation and pleasures and works of charity while in health, and watched over each other tenderly in sickness, for sickness has made long and frequent visits to their dwelling. I would tell you how they slept on the same pillow and had a common purse and adopted each other's relations, and how one of them, more enterprising and spirited in her temper than the other, might be said to represent the male head of the family, and took upon herself their transactions with the world without, until at length her health failed, and she was tended by her gentle companion as a fond wife attends her invalid husband. I would tell you of their dwelling encircled with roses, which now in the days of their broken health bloom wild without their tendance. And I would speak of the friendly attentions which their neighbors, people of kind hearts, of simple manners, seem to take pleasure in bestowing upon them. But I have already said more than I fear they will forgive me for, if this should ever meet their eyes, and I must leave the subject." Well, the letter astounded me. I wasn't surprised to find evidence of a same-sex relationship in the past. My general assumption was that sexual and gender variance existed in the past as in the present, although ideas, labels, and practices might shift over time. What surprised me about Bryant's letter was that an antebellum American writer would so overtly describe a same-sex relationship as a marriage or as like a marriage. Bryant used the familiar poetry of the marriage ceremony from the Book of Common Prayer to structure his description of Charity and Sylvia's relationship, describing how they shared a bed and a purse in sickness and in health, and otherwise conform to those marital vows. After years of research in the culture of the early 19th century United States, I considered myself something of an expert on the topic, but I had no idea that Americans at that time had a concept of same-sex marriage. Every voice in the political sphere in 2004 was telling me otherwise, that same-sex marriage was a new idea, newer than cell phones, Supreme Court Justice Samuel Alito would say in 2013 during oral arguments on California's Proposition 8 banning same-sex marriage. Intrigued, I immediately began to search for more information about Charity and Sylvia. Had they left any papers behind, I wanted to know? A few brief keystrokes later, I discovered that the women had indeed left behind a treasure trove of letters, poems, and diaries, which they had preserved throughout their lives. Those papers were archived naturally at the Henry Sheldon Museum, where I had mused about the richness of the archive only months before. And in the best evidence of a grand intelligence pulling the strings from above, there was a secondary cache of sources related to the women's lives archived in a regional history archive at Northern Illinois University, where I had just accepted my first tenure track position. My historian's spidey senses had borne out. The following summer, I would return to Middlebury for the first of several visits and begin the deep dive into Charity's and Sylvia's archives that would ultimately result in the 2014 publication of my book about the women, Charity and Sylvia, a Same-Sex Marriage in Early America. My research journey along the way supplied resounding proof of my observation on that first visit to the Henry Sheldon, that local museums were the sources of untold treasures. I've discovered this is true not only in general, but more specifically for the histories of sex and gender, which have become the main focus of my scholarship during the past decade and a half. So in the remainder of today's talk, I'm going to walk you through a handful of the discoveries in sex and gender history I've made in visits to local archives since 2004, beginning with a little bit more about Charity and Sylvia. And I hope you experience the same delight in learning these stories as I have experienced in unearthing them. So back to Charity and Sylvia. My visits to Vermont to research the history of Charity and Sylvia, as I said, turned up a treasure trove of documents, not only at the Henry Sheldon, but at local archives throughout the area, and eventually at local archives further afield in states, including New York, Massachusetts, Illinois, and even Washington. At the Henry Sheldon, I found the sort of autobiographical sources that historians dream of finding when they want to make sense of the inner lives of their subjects. The first source I saw before I even entered the museum's archives was a paired set of silhouettes of the women, which may have been cut in 1830 when a traveling silhouette artist came to the village of Weybridge. The silhouettes are a powerful testimony to the love between the women, framed as they are in locks of hair that have been braided into a heart. And you can find similar paired silhouettes of other married couples from this period. So this is a pretty common marriage pose. The museum had the silhouettes labeled as Charity and Sylvia, but at that time we didn't know who was who. I assumed that the silhouette on the right was Charity because the neck was slightly thicker, and I knew that Charity was the older of the pair. Later, Eva carefully peeled back the layers of the silhouette and found their names penciled in as I had intuited, which was very gratifying. If not entirely necessary to my argument, it was still very gratifying. Once I made it through the archive doors, I began reading the diaries, poetries, letters, and ephemeral scraps that remained in Charity's and Sylvia's hands, as well as the letters, autobiographies, and ephemera of their relatives, friends, and members of their community that had also been archived at the museum. The papers of Charity and Sylvia represented only a small slice of the writings they had produced during their lifetimes. There were a few years of Sylvia's daily diaries, preserved, I think, because they captured particularly intense periods of religious experience for her. But all of Charity's diaries, which are mentioned elsewhere by the women, had been destroyed. There were letters written to the women, but far fewer written by them. The museum's card catalog revealed that at least one particularly heated romantic letter from an earlier love of Charity's, named Lydia Richards, had been expunged from the collection by an archivist who'd written on the card that this particular letter was "quote unquote" missing. Something had happened to it. Despite the silences in the record, Charity and Sylvia's writings left behind ample evidence of their love for each other. That love shined through in sources like Charity's 1808 poem on the prospect of separation from Sylvia. So Charity traveled to Weybridge from Massachusetts in 1807, intending to stay for a season, met Sylvia, decided to set up business as a tailor and invited Sylvia to come live with her initially as her apprentice. And then just could never leave. And finally, after a year in Weybridge, had to go back to Massachusetts to speak with her family members. And so this first poem on the left on the prospect of separation is her writing about her fears. Will Sylvia still love her when she returns? Will she remain faithful to her? I saw evidence of the women's deep passion for each other in scraps of paper like the one on the right, likely in Sylvia's hand, combining her names and Charity's, Bryant Charity, Bryant Sylvia, Bryant Charity. By the way, there were Charity Drakes named by Sylvia's siblings after Charity, but there were no Sylvia Bryants. So this was totally, I think, an imagined name. I saw evidence of their love for each other in passages from Sylvia's diary, like this one from 1838, commemorating the women's 31st anniversary, noting it's been 31 years since I left my mother's house and commenced serving in the company with dear Miss B. Sin mars all earthly bliss, and no common sinner have I been, but God has spared my life, given me everything I would enjoy. And now I have a space, if I improve it, to exercise true penitence. Charity and Sylvia's life writings provide really uncommon insight into the women's feelings for each other. But local archives hold so much more information than that. As a historian, I also wanted to know bread and butter questions about their lives, like where did they live? How did they support themselves? What was their standard of living? How were they regarded by their neighbors? At the Weybridge Town Hall, I found the land records, the town meeting records, the tax records, and the church records that enabled me to paint a picture of the economic circumstances of their lives. And to get back to what Eva was saying about like not everything is digitized, the existence of these records was not digitized. I just showed up to the Weybridge Town Hall and asked if they existed, and they did. But I would never have known that, unless I walked through the door and asked. So these quintessential social history type sources, land records and tax records, are really vital to the history of sex and gender. Perhaps the greatest constraint on women who sought to make lives together during the early 19th century was financial. Few women owned land, and wages for women workers were generally too low for independence. Charity and Sylvia scraped a bare living by working relentlessly as tailoresses, a skilled trade that Charity had learned in Massachusetts before coming to Vermont, and then taught to Sylvia, and then eventually to many female apprentices. The tax records enabled me to watch their slow accumulation of wealth over time and witness how they managed to acquire the wherewithal to create their own household, where they'd be out of the control of the male members of the family. The land records disclosed how they found land to rent from Weybridge's only female landholder at that time, an arrangement that probably saved all parties from sexual innuendos, which, where women were concerned, focused on illicit relations with men. These local records gave me a much more nuanced insight into the women's household than I could have gathered from federal records like the US Census, which also captured the existence of Charity and Sylvia's household, but not with the same fine grain. So by looking at local tax records and land records and probate records too, which I found at the Addison County Probate Court in Middlebury, I was able to see how the women combined their finances, how they constructed a joint household like other married couples in the region, and how their finances compared to neighboring households. Eventually, my research into Charity and Sylvia went even deeper than local archives, into privately held family archives. One of the most exciting discoveries I found in a family archive was a handwritten memoir left by a man, Hiram Harvey Hurlburt, who'd grown up in a neighboring town and recalled visiting the women's tailor shop as a boy. He mentioned this visit in his memoir because the women's household was so unusual in his community dominated by male-operated family farms. Hurlburt's diary ended up proving something of a smoking gun, as he recalled that he heard it mentioned, this is a quotation, as if Miss Bryant and Miss Drake were married to each other, and noted that, quote, Miss Bryant was the man, a set of facts that as a child he regarded as perfectly proper. And I got another set of sources from Charity and Sylvia's lives from another private family collector named Randy Hayward, who had a bunch of documents related to Sylvia's older sister, Polly, who was married to a relation of Charity's named Asaph Hayward. And these were the people who had initially invited Charity to Weybridge, where she met Sylvia. So with sources like these, as you can imagine, Charity and Sylvia turned me into an archive rat. I mean, once I had the experience of being amidst these documents, I never looked back. My first book, my dissertation, is written much more on published sources like pamphlet literatures and newspapers. And books, but once I started doing archival research, I couldn't stop. So as I said, I followed Charity and Sylvia's trails beyond Vermont to local archives in other states, and then found news stories that led me to new questions about the history of sex and gender that led me to new local archives in new states and eventually in new countries. And I've been hot on the tail of sex and gender in the archives ever since, at least until the pandemic slowed me down. Although it has been to my great good fortune that so many local archivists have been working assiduously to digitize their collections in the midst of this global catastrophe. So the first place outside Vermont that my Charity and Sylvia research led me to was Illinois. As I mentioned at the beginning of the lecture, soon after learning about Charity and Sylvia's story, I had found out that there were papers of theirs archived in Illinois. Several of Charity's brother Peter Bryant's children, the siblings of William Cullen Bryant, had emigrated from Massachusetts to the new frontier state during the 1830s, and they brought their mother, Sarah Snell Bryant, who was a widow at that point, along with them. A great friend of Charity's, Sarah Snell Bryant had carried with her to Princeton, Illinois, a collection of letters from her sister-in-law. These were some of the only letters written by Charity preserved in any archive, since Charity had given clear instructions to her correspondents to burn her writings after her death. I wish they hadn't listened to her, but it appears they did. So a trip to the Bureau County Historical Society in Princeton yielded not only Charity's letters, but another unexpected discovery. A manuscript book of poems written by Charity's oldest sister, Ruth Bryant, during the American Revolution. Born in 1760 in North Bridgewater, Massachusetts, Ruth Bryant was a teenager when the American Revolution broke out. Like many of her younger siblings, including Charity and Peter, Ruth was an avid poet. The war immediately inspired her to take up her pen. Unfortunately, also, like her siblings, Ruth suffered from tuberculosis, and she lost her battle with that infection in the final year of the war. Her brother Peter preserved her memory by copying out her wartime poetry into a small hand-bound booklet, which his widow later carried with her to the prairies, where it ended up preserved at the County Historical Society. Since the beginnings of American women's history, pioneered by amateur historians in the 19th century, the question of women's experiences during the American Revolution has been central. 19th century writers like Elizabeth Elliot wrote about the heroines of the American Revolution, women who displayed patriotism and courage in the founding of the new nation. A century later, with the rise of the professional field of women's history in the 1970s, American historians like Mary Beth Norton and Linda Kerber began asking questions about the progress of women's rights during the conflict. Was there an American Revolution for women, they wanted to know? Did women gain expanded rights during the revolution? Rights to property, education, political agency, or bodily autonomy? By 2007, when I found Ruth Bryant's revolutionary poetry, a great deal had been written about women and the revolution, but there wasn't a lot out there about teenage girls in the revolution. Like women's history, the field of the history of childhood had emerged out of this general turn towards social and cultural history during the 1970s and 80s. A fair number of books and articles had focused attention on the experience of boys during the American Revolution, tracing how boys had thrown off the shackles of apprenticeship and used the war as an opportunity to secure their own independence from masters and families. But similar work had not been done on teenage girls or on girl children. Ruth Bryant's poems offered a new perspective into what a teenage girl living on the very doorstep of war, they could hear the Battle of Bunker Hill from their fields, thought about the conflict and the birth of the new nation. Bryant's booklet measures 6 inches by 7 1/4, and it includes 6 poems totaling 238 lines. Its first poem is a call to arms following the battles of Lexington and Concord. The final poem is a meditation on Ruth's own imminent death and the political dangers that she saw facing the new nation. Much of the historical literature on women in the Revolution has focused on concepts like Republican motherhood or the Republican wife, 2 models of female patriotism that emphasized women's use of their domestic roles to advocate for expanded access to education and companionate marriages. Bryant's poem, The American Maid's Choice, an extempore, fits this model. The narrator of this courtship poem promises, I choose the gallant warrior brave, while also insisting that her man of choice have steady spirits that must always be free from each fell passion's tyranny. Other poems by Ruth Bryant, however, broke free from the constraints of Republican domesticity, instead revealing how teenage girls might engage in martial and patriotic fantasies, imagining themselves as soldiers and asserting their political consciousness. For example, in the book's first poem, An Address to the Sons of Liberty, written in the year 1775, the narrator groups herself with her brethren who'd marched to battle, declaring, oh, let us dauntless brave the foe and fearless risk our lives in the defense of liberty, of children and of wives. She was 15 when she wrote the poem, so you can't really falter on the, on the meter. My discovery of Ruth Bryant's poetry at the Bureau County Historical Society ultimately led me to write an article exploring how Bryant's youth allowed her and other female teenage poets, some of whose works I found in newspapers at the time, to bend the bonds of gender and express these sort of masculine and martial passions. Bryant's poetry was never published. Well into the 19th century, New Englanders expressed skepticism of the morality of women publishing their writings. Reputational risk plus the general bias against women limited the extent to which their words entered the public sphere. Instead, girls and women tended to circulate their writings privately, copying out each other's words in commonplace books or on scraps of paper. Those commonplace books and ephemera, to the extent they've been preserved, can be found for the most part in private hands and in local history collections. Ruth Bryant's poems were preserved by the members of her family until 1950, when they were donated along with the rest of the Bryant family records to the Bureau County Historical Society. My Illinois research into Charity and Sylvia also yielded another discovery of sex and gender history that ultimately resulted in the publication of an article. As I mentioned, a cache of Charity and Sylvia's papers had been deposited at the Regional History Center at Northern Illinois University, where I accepted my first job in the fall of 2005. When I paid my first visit to this regional history center, I had a long conversation with the archivist about my research topic. You should really take a look, she said, at the papers of this other female couple whose records are archived here. Bring them out, I said. So the archivist brought me a couple boxes from the Shimer Collection. These were records generated by Shimer College, an institution of higher learning founded by an educator named Frances Ann Wood Shimer in Mount Carroll, Illinois in 1853. Shimer was known to everybody by the name Frank. As soon as I opened the archival box, it became evident to me that the records went beyond the archivist's description of them. While it is true that Shimer lived for their first 20 years at Shimer College in the company of a female school teacher named Cinderella Gregory, and during their second 20 years in the company of another female school teacher named Adelia Joy, the evidence in the collection presented a muddy picture of Shimer's own gender identity and raised questions about whether her relationships were same-sex relationships in the same way as Charity and Sylvia's had been. So I closed the box and decided to put it aside for later. After finishing my book about Charity and Sylvia, I came back to the Shimer Collection for a second look. There I found, mixed in with school-related materials like the college's financial records, alumni records, and student publications, the personal papers of Frank Shimer, including school assignments they wrote as a 10-year-old, an autograph album they collected while studying at the New York State Normal School in Albany, letters to their family, and a memoir of Shimer's life dictated and transcribed by Adelia Joy after Shimer's retirement when they had moved together to Florida and became early pioneers of the citrus industry, because Shimer was a person with a lot of energy and a lot of ideas. Frank Shimer's papers spanned from the 1840s through the first decade of the 20th century, which was a period of profound change in gender and sexual norms in the United States. Shimer's papers provided so much more than a window onto an important early woman educator or a glimpse into a Boston marriage, as same-sex relationships between women educators during the late 19th century were frequently called. Shimer's papers revealed how ideas of female masculinity, or what we've come to call trans masculinity, shifted and transformed during the 19th century. Ever since Shimer had been a small child, they had insisted that people call them Frank rather than Francis. And they recounted early memories of borrowing their brother's clothes. And throughout their life, they had repeatedly compared themselves to men and noted how other people called attention to their masculinity. So Shimer's papers ended up providing an incredibly rich source base to write an article exploring the different frameworks for conceptualizing female masculinity that had existed during Shimer's lifetime. And I ended up highlighting 5 frameworks during Shimer's lifetime, and then I used a 6th framework, the framework of trans studies, to analyze Shimer's life from a presentist perspective. So I'll just give you a couple examples, starting with his school assignment. So, I mean, I can't believe Shimer saved their school assignments from when they were 10. When this was their first time sent away from school, they were a very precocious child. So they actually earned their own money, so that because their father wouldn't have been interested. They earned their own money to go away to school at 10 years old for a year, and then saved all their assignments from them. So the school assignments from Shimer's childhood demonstrated their immersion in the era's didactic literature, those periodical essays and fiction and chapbooks and stories written for children that taught them how to be good girls and boys. In these works, straying from gender norms was an immature mistake rather than a sign of an innate gender difference. So these earliest compositions, Frank is already signing Frank, or FA, never uses their given name Francis. And you can sort of see the impact. I do a lot of analyzing in the article, but I won't do it here. You could see how the sort of children's stories of the era end up recirculating in their childhood assignments. Their college autograph album, collected a decade later when they were at the Albany Normal School, which was filled with admiring poems from Shimer's female friends that had been addressed to Frank, like this one, showed a different framework for female masculinity. It showed how female masculinity was incorporated into the norms of romantic friendship during the 1840s and 50s. So romantic friendships were very common at women's schools in the mid-19th century and took the form of close bonds between 2 students, usually marked by gift giving, expressions of devotion, and physical affection. One student in these pairs often took a male name and a male role, as Frank did with their romantic friend, Cinderella Gregory. So you can see that in all these kind of romantic poems written to and addressed to Frank throughout the autograph album. Shimer's letter home to their sister Carolyn Nash captured a 3rd framework for making sense of female masculinity during their lifetime: phrenology, which was the mid-19th century study of cranial characteristics. In December 1854, Shimer invited a famed phrenologist named George Burroughs to visit the Mount Carroll Seminary, later Shimer College. And Burroughs read Shimer's skull and declared that they had, quote, a larger and more powerful brain than the majority of men, and that they were cut out for a man. Phrenology was the first framework of female masculinity during Shimer's lifetime that suggested that their masculinity was something innate and inborn, that it was connected to the cranial organs rather than something acquired or impermanent or like a sign of immaturity. Shimer's memoir, which they dictated to Joy at the end of their life, right at the turn of the century, reveals how the growing field of sexology offered a new framework that shaped their self-understanding in their final years. So sexology was this new science of sexuality that began in Europe in the 1870s and 1880s, associated with people like von Krafft-Ebing or Magnus Hirschfeld. Educators like Shimer were prime targets of sexological writing as experts began warning colleges and college administrators about the risks of allowing intimate relationships between female students. And the emergence of new theories of homosexuality and lesbianism problematized these intimate relationships between female students as antithetical to a healthy heterosexuality. Sexological texts often took the form of case studies with certain stereotype narratives. So lesbian case studies often focused on subjects' early demonstration of what was called gender inversion, things like the girlhood rejection of dolls or the girlhood embrace of rough and tumble games. And Shimer's own memoir, dictated at the very end of their life, followed this format, recounting those very things. But rather than treat gender inversion as evidence of deviance, Shimer's memoir and other sources they authored late in life defended women's break from the confines of traditional gender. Take, for example, an editorial they authored in the Oriad, Shimer College's school magazine, in 1895. So this was the same year that a very notorious attack on the new woman was published in a scientific magazine by a writer named James Weir. And Weir attacks women's suffrage and calls educated women unfeminine androids. And you can see Shimer responding to that in this editorial, which laughs off such anxieties as, in their words, hysterical. So ultimately, the Shimer Collection ended up providing a really unparalleled window into the shifting ways that female masculinity was understood during the 19th century and how those shifting frameworks could shape the identity of a particular gender non-normative individual. So after Charity and Sylvia and after Shimer, I began a new research project on the history of food and sex that took me far afield to local history collections throughout the United States and Europe. And there my diggings continued to yield unanticipated treasures. For example, I found so many treasures when I traveled to the city of New Orleans, a city renowned as a food and sex destination throughout the 19th and 20th centuries. Sure enough, their local history collections delivered up wonders. At the New Orleans Historic Collection, for example, in the French Quarter, I called up boxes of guest registers preserved by a once famous restaurant called Begay's at the corner of Decatur and Madison Streets. Some people claim that Begay's invented brunch. The restaurant, founded in the early 1880s by a French butcher named Hippolyte Begay and his wife, Elizabeth Kettering, served what was called second breakfast, no French word yet, to the butchers who worked nearby at the French market when the market closed at 11 a.m. Every day, the menu centered on a large omelet stuffed with robust fillings like fried oysters, veal and mushrooms, or sweetbreads. Begay's also followed the French model of serving wine with the meal, which stretched for 3 to 4 hours. After the 1884 World's Fair held in New Orleans, Begay's became a tourist attraction. As one enthusiast put it, a meal at the restaurant was, quote, 3 hours of fun eating, drinking, and smoking. The food and wine were not the only attractions at Begay's. The restaurant was also beloved for these famous registers it had, which it kept at the entryway, where drunk guests were encouraged to leave extemporaneous poetry after their meals. Inhibitions lowered by many glasses of wine, Begay's customers often left verses that celebrated the erotic attractions of the Crescent City, as well as its food. And so these restaurants ended up providing sort of an amazing insight into sexual vernacular or ordinary everyday speech of middle-class Americans at the turn of the century. Its writers weren't professional authors. It didn't have to conform to publication standards. These were just kind of spontaneous lines written by drunk tourists who'd been told to write some poetry. Drunkenness frequently interfered with good meter. For example, one verse said, "Here's to your good health, drink wine, get drunk, and never get married." That's from 1902. Another wrote, quote, "Here's to Begay's when you're hungry, champagne when you're dry, a pretty girl when you need one, and Heaven When You Die. Horace Fletcher, a manager of the New Orleans Opera House, who later became a very famous food faddist who invented Fletcherism, like chewing your food a lot, wrote in the books, quote, "I love this town in all its ways. I love its girls so sweet. But best of all, I love Begays when it comes time to eat." Some writers were so drunk that they would give up halfway through, like the newlywed who left this verse, quote, "On your bridal tour, when you and your wife breakfast with Begay, you soon lose sight of the saying trite that lovers don't eat, but say, what's the use of trying to write rhymes at such a time as this? The greatest poet in the world couldn't properly express my appreciation of the breakfast." New Orleans was a common honeymoon destination at the turn of the century, but several authors out and out celebrated the joys of infidelity in the pages of the Breakfast Register. Quote, "My wife went to a summering place. The cook I sent away. I'm having now a good old time breakfasting at Begay." Another tourist wrote, "Some come down here with their wives, but pay more attention to their forks and knives, and others come to connive and take away the others' wives." And another guest annotated that with the entry, "Nothing like this in my family." Even women got in on the game. A guest named Leona Roos wrote, "Chickens like corn, birds like seed, boys like me, and I like feed." And the Bohemian actress Dorothy Usner, who later became a restaurateur in Greenwich Village, struck a scandalous note in the Register, writing, "My only regret when I dined at Begay's was this: I forgot to first discard my stays." Historians of sex and gender who rely exclusively on published sources like marital advice books or sentimental fiction or psychology texts might take away an image of US sexual culture in the late Victorian era or early Edwardian era as entirely buttoned up. But Begay's breakfast registers, with their spontaneous poetry written by happy drunk tourists, captures a bawdier, everyday sexual culture. Although not too sharp a line should be drawn between print culture and archival sources, Begay's breakfast registers were so popular that in 1900, the Southern Pacific Railroad published a pamphlet of Begay's recipes to sell to tourists and filled half the book with transcriptions of the guests' doggerel. Of course, the history of sex and gender is not all fun and games. The feminist scholar Catherine McKinnon once complained that historians of sexuality only like to write about the things that make them feel sexy. The critique is harsh, but not entirely without merit. The history of sexuality also includes much that disturbs contemporary sensibilities, and it's the responsibility of the historian who encounters this material in the archives to bring to light their findings with the same diligence that they apply to salutary tales, like the struggle for equal rights or a sympathetic love story. At least that's what I told myself when my archive rat tendencies led me to unearth a rich vein of archival evidence about one of the greatest sexual taboos of our present day, sexual encounters between adults and children or youth. So while researching the history of food and sex, I came across the story of Norman Douglas. This once famous British author wrote a much beloved 1917 satirical novel, South Wind, set on the fictional island of Nepenthe, based on the island of Capri in the Bay of Naples. Many literary critics and authors, including Graham Greene and Evelyn Waugh, considered South Wind to be one of the most influential books of the interwar period. Douglas's novel described Capri at the turn of the century as a sexual free-for-all, peopled entirely with flashers and bigamists and free lovers. As a historian of sexuality, I naturally wanted to learn more when I read the novel, so I tracked down Douglas's 1933 memoir, Looking Back. I'd heard he was a great Epicurean, and I thought the memoir would combine my interests in food and sex. But I didn't find what I expected. Instead of a memoir of a man who was seen as a sexual reprobate in his own time, but would be celebrated as a pathbreaker in the present, I discovered the story of someone whose sexual practices are far more taboo today than they were during his lifetime. Because Douglas was an unrepentant pederast, a man who spent his lifetime pursuing sexual encounters with children, for the most part boys. He wrote about his sexual predilection for children in his memoir, which was enthusiastically reviewed on both sides of the Atlantic. And this shocked me as much as William Cullen Bryant's letter about his aunts had shocked me a decade earlier. But once again, I wasn't shocked by the evidence of past sexual behavior or even shocked by evidence of the history of child abuse. I was shocked by the evidence of Douglas's ability to write openly about that behavior without being censored, arrested, or despised by everyone he knew. I thought, like, what don't I get about 1933 that like it's totally okay to write about this stuff, and you know, your book gets reviewed in the New York Times and everybody still wants to be your best friend. So my confusion led me back to the archives, where I discovered a surprisingly extensive record of Douglas's sexual history. In the New York Public Library, I found travel diaries that described his sex tourism. At Florence's Anglo-Italian Institute, I found letters to a British writer, you know, where he was open about his love of boys. At Harold Acton's Villa Pietra, a house museum on the city's outskirts, I found marked up copies of Douglas's privately printed books imbued with pederastic humor. In the private collection of Douglas's granddaughter, I found the travel diaries of one of the boys he took with him on his travels. In a corporate archive in the UK, I found the diaries of another of Douglas's boys. I ended up following his trail from the UK to Italy, where he lived most of his life, to Austria, where he was born, back to the US, where the vast majority of his papers were archived at the Beinecke Library at Yale University. And by the time I'd finished my research, I had the material to publish my third book, Unspeakable, A Life Beyond Sexual Morality, which was bravely published by the University of Chicago Press in December 2020. Unlike Charity and Sylvia, this was not a story to cheer anyone's heart. It was a struggle to get it published because of the topic, and it's been a struggle to find readers because of the topic. But speaking personally, I think it's the best thing I've ever written, and perhaps the most important thing I've ever written, because it tackles a subject that's all around us, but that few people wish to spend their time thinking about. And if we want to reckon seriously with the problem of child sexual abuse in the present, we need to understand the history of pederasty. Historians of sexuality have written around this topic for the most part, cutting it out of their scope, like Douglas's friend, the radical journalist Nancy Cunard, did when compiling a biography of her friend. You can see here how she says she's going to use this stuff about how Douglas hated the fascists, but cut out all the stuff about how he's a pederast. This is working on someone else's notes. Honestly, it would have been better for my career if I'd followed Nancy Cunard's example, but I felt an ethical responsibility to share what I'd learned from my research. So brief conclusion, for a long time, and I'll switch to a happier slide. The main subjects of historical scholarship for a long time were public matters of war and politics, and the main characters in this research were the powerful men who directed armies and ruled nations. That single-minded focus shifted in the second half of the 20th century with the rise of fields like social history that focused on the everyday lives of ordinary people, or fields like women's history, Black history, ethnohistory, queer history, API history, all of which included a far broader range of past lives. And the histories of sex and gender have been robust fields of inquiry for decades at this point. Even so, the histories of sex and gender variance before the 20th century remain fragmentary at best. Students and scholars interested in these subjects often face the problem of evidence. There are not that many secondary sources about pre-20th century queer history, and a lot of the scholarship draws on fiction or pornography rather than evidence from ordinary people's lives. And this is especially true for the history of women and trans or non-binary people, who are far less likely to be captured in legal documents such as arrest records and court records than are men and trans feminine people. Last week, I had a student ask me for research tips about lesbians and the French Revolution, and all I could say to her was, check out the scurrilous rumors that Marie Antoinette's enemies spread about her, or, read Diderot's pornographic attacks on nuns. But isn't there anything my student wanted to know, written by women themselves at the time? No, not really. So here's the advice, not that's been written about. So here's the advice I give to all my students in sex and gender history. Go to local archives, armed with an open mind, and see what you find. Talk to archivists and librarians, ask them what's in their collections, and prepare to be amazed. Large institutional archives may be great places to research political history, but they haven't prioritized, for the most part, collecting the evidence of ordinary people's lives, and women and trans feminine or non-binary people through the past have almost always been lumped within that capacious category of kind of like the unimportant. They were rarely the possessors of great power. Many, like Charity and Sylvia, lived quiet lives. Their stories aren't necessarily preserved at the National Archives or the Library of Congress, but they're very likely to be preserved at a local history museum that's been driven by a mission to capture the histories of all the people who lived in a region. And don't count on digitized catalogs to tell you where to find sex and gender in the archives. For so long, these weren't terms that archivists and librarians used. They weren't seen as legitimate fields of historical inquiry. Times have changed. Librarians and archivists are working hard to recatalog historic collections and add search terms that speak to the research concerns of new generations. But the process is incomplete and ongoing, and nothing beats just walking in the door and talking to people and looking through the stacks. And so that's where I'm closing off. I have some pictures of other beautiful sources I could show you, but I want to leave time for questions. So I'll just give you 1 minute of beautiful sources, and then I will open up to questions. This is from New Orleans, a signed autobiography of a famous madam. This was one of my greatest research discoveries. I found a fragment of Isadora Duncan's scarf that throttled her to death at the Opera Archives in Paris. I grew up hearing this story from my mother for reasons, so I was so excited. I know it's macabre. I was very excited when I found this bit of scarf. And let's see, a letter from Sylvia Beach when she was in prison by the Nazis during World War II, written to her lover, Adrienne Monnier, thanking her for sending food. And the cookbook writer, Elizabeth David's wedding license. Okay, I'm going to close out my slideshow. Thanks for bearing with me.
All right, thank you so much, Rachel Hope. This has been absolutely wonderful. And we have a question to get us started. So this is a question on more common historic male-female roles. During the 18th, 19th century in the US, husbands who divorced or were estranged from their wives often claimed, frequently through newspaper ads, that they would no longer be responsible for the debts of the woman, thus indicating that married women accrued debt on behalf of their husbands. Now, the person asking this question says, I'm researching a situation which may be similar. I suspect a wife may have asked authorities to provide pauper's support for a former household servant, not a relative. After the authorities spent funds on her former servant, they tried to recover their funds by taking the woman's husband to court. Records indicate that the man was the defendant in the case and not the wife, but as the head of the household, could the husband have been held liable for his wife's act while she was never mentioned in the records?
Well, that's a really interesting question. So these ads, I know exactly what you're talking about, and there's some great literature on them. It's called self-divorce, because the legal limitations on divorce were so steep that it was very hard to get like in many states, you needed an act of legislature to acquire a divorce in the early 19th century. Yes, so for ordinary people without political connections or great wealth, a much more reasonable thing to do is just separate. And then you would see these ads, right, where the husband says, I'm not responsible for any debts. What that means is the marriage is dissolved. Do not, don't treat my wife or my ex-wife really as, part of my household any longer. So in the 19th century, for the most part, the law of coverture still defined the legal form of marriage in the United States. This meant that when women married men legally, all of their property became their husbands, and any wages they earned became their husbands, and all in sort of as a civic entity, their personhood was totally subsumed within their husband's personhood. And so, any debts that were acquired by a wife were owed by the husband, because a wife had no independent property except, on occasions where, let's say, a wealthy woman was left property under like certain instruments by a father or something like that. So like the wealthy could come up with trusts and other arrangements to try to secure independent property to women, but for the most part that wasn't the case, and that's why that's why men, when they self-divorced from wives, posted those notes saying, I won't be responsible anymore for any debts that my, ne'er-do-well wife, or ex-wife acquires. And that doesn't change really until, like, I think the passage of Marital Women's Property Acts in the late 19th century. And obviously this continues to be very much enforced throughout the 20th century, really. And is one of the reasons like why women can't acquire credit cards in their own name. Married women can't acquire their own credit cards until like the second wave feminist movement. I hope that answers your question. I don't know if I've entirely answered it.
And just because you use the word ex-wife kind of euphemistically in that answer, I'm curious if there was any kind of like name attached to this category of people who were, separated from each other legally at this point, but
there are some terms that come up, like grass widow, I think is is like a 19th century term. I think that's one of the terms they use for basically a woman who's been abandoned by her husband. Her husband's not really dead, but also, I mean, in the days before the internet, people could just move. So, I mean, there were lots of people who were bigamously married. They just abandoned their spouses and went somewhere else and then got married again. And I mean, and so women would do that as well, out of sight, out of mind. I thought he was dead, right? I haven't seen him for 7 years. He must be dead.
All right. And another question, fascinating talk. One large and obvious archive would be the Schlesinger Library. Have you looked there? And if so, have you found anything relevant?
Oh yeah, that final slide of Elizabeth David's marriage license, that she's like the great, grande dame of British cookery in the 20th century, that comes from the Schlesinger. So yes, I have been to the Schlesinger on many occasions, and I'm sort of writing this long overdue book on the history of food and sex, and there's going to be a big part on women food writers. And so I have sort of extensively plunged that's not the right word I'm looking for, plunged into maybe the papers of Elizabeth David and MFK Fisher and Julia Child, all of which are there. And then I've really enjoyed their amazing collection of historic cookbooks. And then actually, I can't remember, I think Sarah Snell Bryant's day-to-day diaries are either at the Schlesinger or at Houghton, which is like another library at Harvard. I can't remember which, but it's definitely at Harvard, one or the other. So I love the Schlesinger.
All right. And a question, have you read Sex in the Archives by Barry Ray? And if so, thoughts? I read it and wrote a book review on it for a class last year from someone.
I know Barry Ray, and I have read at least 2 books by Barry Ray, but I don't think I've read that one. So I can't give you thoughts, but what are your thoughts?
All right, feel free to type some more thoughts into the chat. And in the meantime, another question, do you have a favorite person or couple that you've researched to date?
Not
or maybe a least favorite.
I have a terrible time with favorites. I'm not good at picking favorite anything. So that's a tough question for me. I think I love whoever I'm working on at the moment. I'm rather inconstant and fickle, and I get very obsessed with projects, and I am 100% in them. And then as soon as they're done, they're like out of sight, out of mind, and I'm on to the next thing. So I have a new favorite right now, who is like my project after the food and sex book. I've been working on a narrative history of this 19th century adventuress, an American woman who was from a very prominent religious family, a very well-known family filled with writers, who decided to pursue life as a high-end courtesan, and took herself off to Paris and then eventually to Imperial Russia, and gotten a lot of trouble and ended up being arrested by the secret police, and was the only American, like non-Jewish person exiled from Russia in the 19th century. And so I don't want to say more, but it's a really exciting story that involves Romanov diamonds and, the secret police and, jewel thievery and prostitution. So she's my current favorite person, not a good person, but definitely an interesting person.
Wow, we'll have to stay tuned for your next 2 books.
When I get back, when I'm allowed back into the archives. Unfortunately, I had recently put in a grant application to go to Russia, among other places, but I will not be doing that.
And actually, we have a response in from the person who asked about the book, Sex in the Archives. She says, it's very good. It's a look at the sexual lives beyond the norms of society, all through archival sexual photographs and diary entries. It suggests some interesting theory around how to work with the erotic in archives.
Sounds great. Yeah, well, I like Barry Ray's work, so. And I don't think I have that one, but I should, it sounds like.
All right, and while we're waiting for a couple more questions from the audience to come in, I'll ask you a question of my own. So you've researched same-sex couples who both identify as men and women throughout your research, and I'm curious if you found maybe in the earlier generations of scholarship and the first, in the kind of historiography of these various male and female identifying people engaged in these same-sex relationships, have you found that scholars have treated, gay women differently than gay men?
Oh, yes. Why, yes, they have. I mean, it's not really surprising. It is certainly the case that the vast majority of queer historiography has focused on men. And that's because the vast majority of historiography has focused on men. And women have just been an afterthought. And a lot of our models for what queer history looks like have been shaped by the history of men. And it's not necessarily the case that the history of same-sex sexuality or intimacy among women or among female identified people or among transmasculine people has followed the same parameters and dimensions. So, sex between men in the last couple centuries has been heavily policed. Sex between male-bodied people. And so, there's a lot of history that has come out of court records and arrest records. And there is a model of the history of queer sexuality, which places a huge emphasis on urbanization and anonymity, the shift from rural life to city life, and the opportunities that opens for cruising and same-sex sexual expression. And a lot of these just really are not as significant in the history of women. So a lot of women in the 19th century who sought to make same-sex households, their vision of where they could locate those households was the country, not the city. The 20th century is another story, but in the 19th century, the fantasy was Charity and Sylvia's fantasy. It's a quite widespread fantasy of having a cottage in a vale that you could call your own, right? Whether it's the ladies of Llangollen and Wales or Charity and Sylvia or others. And again, the law didn't particularly criminalize sexual intimacy between women because it wasn't seen as sex, or because it wasn't threatening to the power structure in the same way, because it, and also because women just weren't subjects of the law in the same way. The law was just a lot more concerned with, men and males. So, there are all sorts of statutes that just weren't written in a way that was particularly attentive to the existence of females. And so, yeah, so I think there is, profound differences, and just a lot more research has been done and continues to be done about men, and much more should be done. We get, even though, like I said, my talk, women's history now has this long history, there's really still not enough. There's really not enough.
Yeah, Yeah, I mean, 50 years of women's history as a discipline at this point versus however long history has been written.
Continues to be, if you're lucky, like one women's history slot in a department faculty, right? And I mean, and not because actually there's really been this shift, which I participate in and I'm totally, you know, admiring of, towards more like gender history and the history of sexuality. But like, I mean, women's history is like.
All right, well, you know, if any last questions, going to trickle in, you know, feel free to put them in the chat. But thank you so much to you, Rachel Hope, and thank you for everyone who joined us tonight. This is the penultimate talk in the Elephant in the Room series, which is hard to imagine. It feels like it was just yesterday that we were seeking funding for this from Vermont Humanities. But if you were in the audience and you enjoyed this talk, we do encourage you to donate to the Stuart Swift Research Center. We hope to make lots more free, wonderful programming like this, and your donation will help us do that. And with that being said, thank you all for joining us, and I hope you have a wonderful Wednesday night.
Thank you.